The key turned with its usual satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped into the silence of my own apartment. The quiet, a welcome relief after the 8-hour drone of office small talk and the insistent hum of fluorescent lights. I dropped my work bag on the floor, a little heavier than usual, and shrugged off my coat, hanging it on the hook by the door. It was a Tuesday, a completely unremarkable Tuesday. The apartment was dark. The only light, a faint orange glow from the street lamp outside the living room window, filtered through the blinds. It painted thin, distorted stripes across the floor and furniture. I didn't bother turning on a light. I knew this space by heart. I walked the familiar path to the kitchen, my sock-covered feet silent on the hardwood. That's when I first felt it. Not a draft, exactly. More like a change in pressure, a subtle shift in the density of the air in the room. It was the faintest sensation of movement, as if a large, silent animal had just passed behind me in the dark. I froze, one hand on the kitchen door frame, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs. I listened. The building was old. It always had its noises, the groan of pipes, the distant murmur of a neighbor's television. But this was a different kind of quiet, a held-breath quiet. I shook my head, annoyed at myself, just tired. My imagination was playing tricks, conjuring phantoms from shadows and silence. I continued into the kitchen, poured a glass of water from the tap, and drank it while looking out the small window at the brick wall of the building next door. Normal sounds, normal view. Everything was normal. I walked back through the living room towards the hallway that led to my bedroom. As I passed the large mirror hanging on the wall, I caught my own movement in the corner of my eye, a blur of my dark shirt. I stopped, looking at my reflection. I looked tired, my face a pale oval in the dim light. I stared for a second, then continued on. But as I moved, something felt off. The reflection's movement had been mine, but the timing felt delayed, a fraction of a second too slow. A lag, I turned back, facing the mirror squarely. I stood perfectly still. My reflection stood perfectly still. I raised my right hand slowly. It raised its left hand, perfectly synchronized. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Tired. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the aftermage of my own motion, confusing my tired brain. I went to bed, the next morning. I dismissed it completely. The apartment was bright with sunshine. I got ready for work, deliberately avoiding looking at the mirror in the hallway. It was just a mirror. That afternoon, I worked from home. I set up my laptop on the dining table, the afternoon sun warming the room. I was on a video call, my face a small box in the corner of the screen. I was talking, gesturing, when I glanced at my own image. Behind me, in the frame, was the open doorway to the hallway, and in that doorway, a shadow, just a slice of darkness, darker than the hall itself, as if someone was standing just out of sight, pressed flat against the wall, watching. My voice faltered for a second, a hiccup in my sentence. I forced myself to look away from the screen, to physically turn and look at the hallway. It was empty. Just the usual strip of light from the bedroom window at the far end. I turned back to the call, my smile feeling plastic, and finished the meeting. I tried to reason with it. A trick of light and shadow, an errant sunbeam. But after the call, I got up, and walked to the hallway. I stood in the exact spot where the shadow would have been. There was nothing there. Of course, that night, I was in the kitchen making dinner, chopping vegetables. The rhythmic thump of the knife on the cutting board was a comforting, normal sound. I reached for a bowl in an upper cabinet, and as I stretched up on my toes, my t-shirt rode up. In the reflection of the dark window above the sink, I saw a pale strip of my own skin, and on it, just above my hip, was a mark. It was faint, a dull, yellowish purple, the size of a thumbprint, a bruise. I didn't remember bumping into anything. I pulled my shirt down and stared at the window, but could only see my own wide eyes looking back. The mark was still there the next morning, but it had changed. It was darker now, a deeper purple, and it was no longer a single print. It was a handprint. 4 fingers and a thumb spread across my ribs. The fingers were long, inhumanly so, the tips curving round towards my back. I traced the outline with my own fingers, my skin crawling. The bruise was tender to the touch. I took a picture of it with my phone, a cold, clinical act of documentation, proof, evidence that I wasn't imagining things. I spent the day in a state of low-grade dread. I Googled unexplained bruising, sleep paralysis, sensed presence. The results were a mess of medical advice and ghost stories, none of which fit. This wasn't a presence I felt when I was half asleep. This was a presence I felt in the stark, sober reality of my own home. It was in the air with me. That night. I didn't want to go home. I drove around for an hour, got fast food I didn't eat, and finally pulled into my parking spot, my stomach tight with fear. The apartment was dark, as always. I stood in the doorway, hand on the light switch, before flicking it on. The hallway was flooded with harsh, artificial light, empty. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed. I was alone, I went to bed with the lights on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building's noises. The groaning pipe, the hum of the refrigerator. Then, a new sound, a faint, dry whisper, like fabric brushing against a wall. It came from the living room. I froze, my body rigid. The whisper came again, closer this time. A soft, shuffling sound, as if something was being dragged slowly across the carpet. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see the strip of light from the living room, and in that light, a shadow passed, slow, deliberate. It was a solid, defined shape, not a trick of the light. It moved from left to right, blocking the light for a full second before it was gone. I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shuffling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper and more profound than any silence I had ever known. It was a presence in itself, a weight pressing down on the room. Then, the doorknob moved. A tiny, metallic click as the mechanism was tested. It turned just a fraction of an inch, then stopped. A long pause. Then it turned again, more forcefully this time, a sharp, distinct rattle against the strike plate. It was trying to get in. My phone was on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unlock it. I didn't know who to call. The police? And say what? That a shadow was trying to open my door. I just wanted light. I opened the camera app and switched to video, pointing it at the door. A pathetic, useless act of defiance. a way to make it real, to capture it. The knob rattled again, harder, a frantic, insistent shaking. Asterisk, then it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I held the phone, my thumb pressed against the screen, recording nothing but the image of a cheap, hollow core door. Minutes passed, an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, the gray light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. The terror receded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Asterisk, when the sun was fully up, I got out of bed. I walked to the door, my legs unsteady. I opened it. The living room was exactly as I had left it. Everything was in its place. But on the floor, just outside my bedroom door, was a single, wet footprint. It was a bare foot, larger than my own, the impression of 5 long toes pressed into the wood. It was already beginning to evaporate, the edges fading even as I stared at it. Asterisk, I didn't wait to see it disappear completely. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and walked out of my apartment without looking back. I haven't been back since. I'm writing this from a hotel room. I don't know what was in my apartment. I don't know what left that bruise on my skin, what rattled my doorknob, or what stood in my living room watching me sleep. But I know it was real. The bruise is still there, a faint, fading constellation on my ribs. The only proof I have that I am not insane. A reminder that the dark is not always empty, and that sometimes when you are alone, you are not. The silence in this house isn't empty. It's stuffed full of something pressing against the walls. I noticed it the first night after my wife left. Not the silence of her absence that was different. That was a void. This was a presence, a thick auditory humidity that made my ears pop. Asterisk, it started with the thermostat. I'd be reading in the living room, and I'd hear the quiet tick from the hallway as it clicked on. Then, a second later, I'd hear it again, an echo. But the furnace is in the basement, directly below the hallway. Sound doesn't travel that way. It was a perfect, synchronized double click, one from the unit on the wall, and one from somewhere deep in the guts of the house. I told myself it was pipes settling, the usual excuses we feed ourselves to keep the primal panic at bay. Asterisk, I'm a photographer. I work from home in the converted garage. My studio is my sanctuary. Last Tuesday, I was doing a series of still lifes, old books, and dried flowers. I left a shot set up overnight, the aperture wide, the lighting perfect. I wanted to catch the first light of dawn. When I came down the next morning, the composition was wrong. The main book, a heavy folio of Audubon prints, had been moved about 3 inches to the left. Not knocked over, moved, deliberately placed. My first irrational thought was that my wife had come back in the night to rearrange things. A final, petty act of domestic sabotage. But the doors were all locked, bolted from the inside. The alarm was still set. Asterisk, that's when I started to look. Really look. Not for signs of a break-in, but for signs of occupancy. I checked the dusty corners of the attic. I peered into the crawl space under the stairs. Nothing, but the feeling grew. It was a constant, low-grade awareness, like being watched by a crowd standing just behind a one-way mirror. I stopped walking around the house in my underwear. I started closing the bathroom door. The small, mundane courtesies you afford a guest you don't want to offend. Asterisk, 3 nights ago, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. My internal clock was precise. I wasn't startled by a noise. I was woken by the cessation of it. The house's hum, the faint drone of the refrigerator, the whisper of the heater, it had all stopped. The silence was so complete, it was a physical weight on my chest. I lay there, frozen, listening to the rush of blood in my own ears. And then, from the hallway, I heard footsteps, not a heavy tread, a soft, shuffling walk. The kind of walk you do in the dark, feeling your way, bare feet on hardwood. 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, then a pause, then 5 steps back. Asterisk, I didn't sleep. I sat up with my back against the headboard, a heavy glass paperweight in my hand, waiting for the doorknob to turn. It didn't. At dawn, the footsteps faded, replaced by the usual creaks and groans of a waking house. I searched the hallway. Nothing. No marks on the floor. No disturbed rugs. But the air in that hallway was different, colder, staler, as if it had been breathed. Asterisk. I set up a camera in the hallway, a motion-activated DSLR on a tripod, pointing toward the stairs. I told myself it was for evidence, for my sanity. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my bedroom, door locked, listening. I heard the footsteps again at 3:17, the same pattern. 4 steps, pause, 5 steps back. But this time, they stopped in the middle of the hallway, right where my camera was. Asterisk. In the morning, I practically ran to the camera. My hands were shaking as I pressed the playback button on the LCD screen. The first few frames were just the empty hallway, time-stamped in the corner. Then, at 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 2 seconds, the image changed. The air in the frame seemed to thicken, to warp, like heat haze over asphalt. In the next frame, the distortion was more profound. It had a shape, a man-shaped void in the reality of the hallway, a standing column of shimmering wrongness. The next frame was black. The camera had been knocked over. The last frame, taken at an angle from the floor, showed the hallway as it was, empty. But on the wall, written in what looked like dust or fine ash, was a word. It was smeared, as if written by a trembling finger. The word was mine. Asterisk. I didn't call the police. What would I say? My ghost vandalized my house. I cleaned the wall. I threw the camera in the trash. I spent the next day in the city, in crowds, in noise, trying to convince myself I was a man with a vivid imagination and a recent marital collapse. Asterisk. I came home late. The house was quiet, but it was a normal quiet. I felt a flicker of hope. I went to bed, exhausted, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Asterisk. I woke up to the sound of a camera shutter. Click. WHIRR. Click. My eyes snapped open. It was dark. The sound was coming from the foot of my bed. Click. Whir. A faint red light was blinking in the darkness. The autofocus assist beam of my DSLR, the one I'd thrown in the trash. It was on my tripod, aimed directly at my bed. I couldn't move. I could only stare at the blinking light as it took picture after picture of me lying there, paralyzed with terror. The camera was operating itself, panning slowly from left to right, documenting my horror. Asterisk. Then, the footsteps started. Not in the hallway this time. They were in my room, on the other side of my bed. The soft shuffle of bare feet on the wooden floor. I could feel the slight vibration through the bed frame. It walked around the foot of the bed, past the camera. I saw the floorboards depress slightly, one by one, as if under an invisible weight. It stopped beside me. I could smell it then. Not rot, not decay. Something worse. The smell of attic dust, old, sun-baked wood, and underneath it all, the faint, cloying scent of my wife's perfume. The one she wore on our first date, the one she stopped wearing years ago. Asterisk, I felt a depression in the mattress, right on the edge of the bed. It was sitting down. The weight was slight, tentative. A cold began to emanate from that spot. A cold so profound, it sucked the warmth from the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't close my eyes. I just stared at the ceiling, feeling the hairs on my arms stand on end as something cold, like a draft, but with intent, traced a line down my cheek. Asterisk then, a whisper. It wasn't in my ear. It was inside my head. A dry, rustling voice, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It said my wife's name, not as a question, as a statement of fact, of ownership. It said it the way you'd run your finger over a name carved into a tree trunk years ago. Then it said my name. And then the voice, layered with a terrible, possessive intimacy, whispered, "Our home." Asterisk, the cold receded. The weight lifted from the bed. The camera stopped clicking and fell silent. The first gray light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. I lay there until the sun was fully up, staring at the spot where it had sat. The sheet was pristine, but the air there was still cold. And on my pillow, inches from my face, was a single, long, gray hair. Not my wife's, not mine. Asterisk, I'm not in the house anymore. I'm in a motel room 6 towns over. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. The police think I'm having a breakdown. My wife won't take my calls. But the thing is, the room is quiet now. Too quiet. I can hear the hum of the a car passing on the highway. Normal sounds. But underneath it all, I can feel it starting. That familiar pressure in my ears. The silence isn't empty here either. It's just following, waiting. And tonight, at 3:17 a.m., I'm terrified. I'm going to find out. It was never the house that was haunted. It was me. The thing about grief is that people expect it to look a certain way. They expect tears, a drawn face, a certain slowness of movement. They don't expect you to wash the dishes or laugh at a commercial or sleep through the night. When my wife, Sarah, died, I did all of those things. I was a model of functionality, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. That's what my mother-in-law said, anyway, before she stopped calling. Asterisk, the truth was simpler and far less admirable. I just didn't believe she was gone. It wasn't a spiritual thing, no comforting delusion of an afterlife. It was a practical, stubborn refusal of my own senses. Her side of the bed was cold. Her coffee mug sat clean in the rack. Her voice was absent from the rooms of our small house. But some deep, animal part of my brain kept waiting for her to walk through the door. It was like a computer program running in the background, a constant low-level process of anticipation. I'd hear a car door and my head would lift. I'd hear footsteps on the sidewalk and my hand would freeze mid-motion. A part of me was always listening. Asterisk, the noises started about 3 weeks after the funeral. Not the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. This was something else. The first time, I was in the kitchen, making a sandwich I didn't want. It came from the bedroom, a soft, distinct thump, not loud, but definite, like a heavy book falling from a nightstand onto a carpeted floor. Asterisk, I went to check. My heart, a dull, heavy thud in my chest. The room was empty, of course. The bed was made, the curtains still. I checked the floor by the nightstand. Nothing. I even checked the books on her shelf, running my finger along their spines. All were perfectly in place. I stood there for a long minute, listening to the silence, and then I went back to my sandwich. The program in my brain logged it. No, just the house. Asterisk, over the next few nights, a single, deliberate footstep in the hallway, the soft creak of a floorboard right outside the living room door, the unmistakable sound of the bathroom cabinet, the one with the mirrored door, being opened and then gently closed. That last one froze the blood in my veins. That cabinet had a specific sound, a slight, sticky hesitation before it clicked shut. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times as Sarah got ready for bed, and I heard it clear as day at 2:17 on a Tuesday morning. Asterisk, I didn't get up that time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining so hard they ached. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I did nothing. I told myself it was the pipes, the wind, the natural contraction of wood after a warm day. But the program in my brain had updated. It was no longer just waiting for her to return. It was now cataloging evidence that she might have. Asterisk, the third week, I started finding things moved. At first, it was small, deniable things. A pen I kept in a drawer was on the kitchen counter. The remote control was on the coffee table when I was certain I'd left it in the armchair. I'm a creature of habit, a man who needs order. I don't misplace things, but grief does strange things to memory. Everyone knows that, so I accepted it. I put the pen back. I put the remote back. Asterisk, then, it was her things. I kept everything of hers exactly as it was. Her hairbrush on the dresser, a scarf draped over the back of a chair, her slippers side by side on her side of the bed. One morning, I noticed the slippers weren't parallel anymore. The right one was angled, as if someone had stood in them and then stepped out. I stared at them for a full minute. The rational part of my brain offered an explanation. I must have nudged them when I was making the bed. I hadn't made the bed that morning. Asterisk, I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? My friends already looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. My mother-in-law's calls had stopped because my cheerful, functional updates were, I think, more disturbing to her than tears would have been. I was alone with this, alone in the house with the sounds and the displaced objects. Asterisk. It was a Thursday night when the fear finally crystallized into something I could name. I was in the living room trying to read. The house was quiet, and then I heard it, breathing. Soft, slow, regular breathing, coming from the hallway just outside the door. It wasn't my own. It was too close to present. It was the sound of someone standing in the dark, watching me. Asterisk, I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stared at my book, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, 10 seconds, maybe 30. Then, with a soft, shuffling sound, it moved away, down the hall, towards the bedroom. I sat there until dawn, my body rigid, every nerve ending a live wire. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. The next morning, in the cold light of day, I convinced myself it was my imagination, grief-induced psychosis, auditory hallucinations. I needed help. I was losing my mind. I picked up the phone to call my doctor, but as I held it to my ear, my eyes fell on the hallway. On the floor, just at the entrance to the bedroom, was a damp footprint, a bare foot, about the size of Sarah's foot. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the hook. I walked to the hallway on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I knelt down. The print was there, a faint gray outline of toes and a heel on the hardwood floor. It was slowly drying, fading as I watched. The floor around it was bone dry. It was as if someone had just stepped out of the shower and taken one single step. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, a heavy flashlight in my hand. The silence was thick, oppressive. I waited. The hours crawled by. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., I started to relax. Just a fraction. Maybe it was over. Maybe I'd finally a key turned in the front door lock. The sound was so mundane, so utterly normal, that for a second my mind went blank. Then the door handle moved. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold night air. The hallway beyond was black. And then she stepped inside. It was Sarah. It was her face, her body, her dark hair. She was wearing the gray sweatpants and the old t-shirt of mine she always slept in. She was wet. Her hair was plastered to her head, her clothes clinging to her skin, dripping onto the doormat. She looked exactly as she had the last time I saw her alive, when she'd gotten out of the shower on that Sunday morning 3 months ago, smiling, saying she'd be right back. She took a step into the hall, her wet foot making a soft, sucking sound on the wood. Her eyes were open, but they weren't looking at me. They were fixed on a point just past my shoulder, vacant and dark. Her mouth was slightly open. A single drop of water, cold and dark, fell from her chin. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The flashlight was in my hand, a dead weight. She took another step, her gaze never shifting. She was heading for the bedroom. As she passed me, just a few feet away, I caught the smell. It wasn't the smell of her shampoo or her skin. It was the smell of deep, still water. The smell of a pond in winter. The smell of mud and cold and the absolute heavy silence of the earth. She walked down the hall, her wet feet leaving a trail of dark prints on the floor. She reached the bedroom door and paused. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, I thought she would turn and look at me. But she didn't. She just walked through the doorway and disappeared into the darkness of our room. I sat there until the sun came up. The front door was still wide open. The trail of wet footprints was still there, leading from the door, past me, and into the bedroom. They hadn't dried. They were still there, dark and stark, against the pale wood. When it was fully light, I finally forced myself to stand. My body ached. I walked to the bedroom door, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. I looked inside. The room was empty. The bed was still made, but the floor on her side of the bed was wet. A large, dark stain had soaked into the wood where she would have stood. And her slippers, the ones that had been angled, were gone. In their place was a small puddle of water, perfectly still, reflecting the gray morning light from the window. I stared at it for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen, found a towel, and knelt down to wipe it up. The program in my brain, the one that had been waiting for her, was finally, blessedly quiet. I knew exactly where she was now. She was home, and I understood, with a terrible, hollow clarity, that grief wasn't about letting go. It was about waiting for them to come back. And sometimes they do.